Hello everybody, this is ManuS and welcome to another Legends of Runeterra deck tech. Today I want to talk to you guys about Shen Fiora. Deck has been around for a bit again and I figured it's finally time to cover it in a deck tech. It's still, or again, quite good and I'm quite liking it in the current metagame, so I figured it's a good opportunity to catch you up on the archetype and my current likings. Like the last time I wanted to do a deck tech, it kind of fell out of favor and wasn't very well positioned, but now with the recent balance changes that the last two balance changes shifted more into its favor again, so it's a good opportunity. The deck never quite went away, but it wasn't quite worth talking about, I think. Well, now it seems like a better time to talk about it. Alright, you know the drill. Before we dive into the cards, hit the subscribe button down below if you haven't yet to not miss out on future content. And now let's take a look at the deck. Alright, so first off, it's a fairly proactive deck, but it's not quite your typical mid-range deck, nor is it an aggro deck. It's kind of a more of a sort of tempo-y or like aggro controlling deck. It has a very like proactive plan in general, but it doesn't have the usual like sort of just drop quality bombs, grind your opponent out mid-range type of plan, and it's also not like proactive enough and dedicated enough to be aggressive, as you can quickly see from the curve, only having 1/2 drop and stuff like that, being pretty spell heavy. The closest comparison you would have in games like Magic, for example, would be the threat lighter, spell heavier decks like Delver and stuff. They're still like kind of different because of differences in the game, but that's like the general direction, where you have a couple of high quality threats, a bunch of good support spells, and you use those spells to sort of protect and support your high quality threats, rather than having the usual aggro thing of just a lot of good threats up the curve, very consistent curve with a couple of support spells, or in mid-range where it's more like just value cards and curving out, dropping the best card at every curve slot, going all the way up and kind of overpowering your opponent with raw card quality and board presence. While here you're more trying to sort of outmaneuver your opponent and keep control of the game while being proactive. So it has these controlling elements that are aimed at controlling the opponent's board presence, the opponent's speed, and so on and so forth, and also the opponent's reactions, because that also works really well against reactive decks, which is why it's important for this to be in Ionia, because deny is a big part of the plan here. But we'll talk about the units first. First off, we have 2 premium 1-drops. That's kind of a big deal for a deck like this, since normally, if it was just the usual sort of aggressive 1-drops that are good early on but are not like good in general, they wouldn't be very interesting for a deck like this. But both Fleet Feather Tracker and Greenglade Caretaker scale really well into the game. The fact that Tracker has Challenger makes him really good late in the game still, because he can kill utility units later that you need to get rid of. He can pull big blockers to get in damage. He can team up with combat tricks to kill bigger stuff. He just has a lot of utility, unlike a normal 1-drop that can just attack and block and gets outclassed really quickly. So Challenger is kind of the big deal here. And Greenglade Caretaker is similar. She's weaker than your average 1-drop on turn 1, but scales really, really well into the later game and can trade even with like 10 drops from the opponent, depending on how the game goes. So it's a card that never really gets invalidated, other than just still remaining kind of fragile. So the quality of these two and the fact that they scale well with what the deck is doing and the longer the game goes makes them really good here. And since the deck kind of cares about mana efficiency and tempo a lot, them being really cheap also matters. Obviously, Bright Steel Protector pairs really well with both of them, lets you challenge for free with Tracker, and buffs your Caretaker, giving you the nice like Caretaker into Protector, attack for 6 on turn 2, aggressive start on even sometimes. With Warchefs nerfed, there isn't really another 2-drop a deck like this would want, which is why there simply isn't one in the deck. Warchefs is too bad now. I tried Young Witch for a while, but Young Witch just kind of seemed a bit too fragile and situational. Dragon Guard Lieutenant would be an amazing 2-drop for a deck like this, but the deck simply doesn't have the dragon support for it. The deck is also not a deck that plays in a way where Eye of the Dragon works well. Your spells are mostly reactive, so you kind of use them to react to what your opponent's doing, so you don't want to proactively use them to turn your dragon links on. And the other thing is your spells are pretty expensive, so Eye of the Dragon doesn't really work here either. Blade Twirler would also be a potentially good card for a deck like this, but since we're not in like stun recall stuff, that also doesn't work. Egghead Researcher seems okay, but the body itself is very impactless here, and the dragons you get vary kind of heavily in how desirable they are, and I don't think Egghead Researcher would be better than any of the spells you would have to cut for him, basically. And everything else is just too weak and or doesn't really fit the plan. Like stuff like Green Glade Duo and so on is not something the deck cares about. Mage Seeker, once again, would be great if the deck would have the support to reliably turn it on, but that's kind of the problem with Persuader, inherently that it's kind of hard to reliably turn it on. Then we have Fiora and River Shaper. Fiora is one of the key cards in the deck. It's one of the things the deck can do really well. It can threaten Fiora kills pretty well because it's good at protecting Fiora, but it doesn't have to, so don't be too hung up on your Fiora. Highly depends on the matchup, how viable and worthwhile it is to try and go for a Fiora kill. But regardless of what you're facing, she's a decent beatdown body at worst, and at best she's a great board control tool in a lot of ways and a potential win condition. River Shaper, another similar thing. Not the best threat, but against reactive decks it still deals damage, it still pressures them a bit, and it also indirectly pressures them because it's drawing you cards, so it's generating card advantage and putting you further and further ahead with every time it gets to strike, and the deck is pretty good at making it strike between barriers from all kinds of sources and stuff like single combat and especially concerted strike is really, really well with River Shaper. Then we have our 1/4 drop, Shen. Just a great way to protect River Shaper, Fiora, and Tracker and make Caretaker better, basically, and also the bigger challengers, obviously. And also just allowing the deck to scale better later, since in longer games, when you get to level Shen, the extra buff he provides means that your units scale better into bigger late game threats from the opponent, for example, or just are able to deal more damage. Then we have Screeching Dragon. This originally in the past used to be Swiftwing Lancer, and I was initially one of the people that was quite skeptical of giving up on Lancer because, Lancer is card advantage, it's never bad. It also is better at dealing with some units due to being 5 attack. Like there's a bunch of like 5/5s or 5 health units in the game that Lancer is much better at dealing with a Shen, for example, than Dragon. But I've been pretty happy with Dragon by now, since the deck is so good at protecting units, and Dragon is much harder to kill than Lancer because of the extra health and the Fury, and also the fact that the deck is pretty good at protecting it in the first place means sometimes you kill something without even taking damage and then the unit grows, so it scales pretty well. But in grindier games it can have the downside of not providing an extra body, and Lancer has a couple of really powerful rolls. And the other thing is that the deck can sometimes be a bit light on bodies, on units, and Lancer providing that is pretty nice there. But currently I'm pretty happy with Dragon over Lancer after playing with both for quite some time. Then we have Genevieve. She got nerfed recently, but she's still pretty good, and I think she's still the card you want. I've seen some people playing Citria in the deck, but Citria really doesn't make much sense here. Citria requires you much more to have a wider board for her to be useful, because she herself is just a 6-cost 6/6, which is pretty uneventful compared to like a 5/4 Scout Challenger. And the Challenger really matters in this deck, given that the deck isn't about like beating your opponent down, it's about controlling your opponent's board while controlled pressuring them at the same time. And Genevieve pairs really well with Refuge against aggressive decks to gain a lot of health back. She can catch you back up from behind with multi-challenging to kill multiple units to stabilize the board, and she still provides the +1/+1 buff to your other units. And sometimes even without attacking, when them attacking wouldn't be so good, which doesn't happen that often, but it still can come up. So all in all, I think Genevieve, even with the lost health point, which certainly matters, is still notably better than Citria in this deck, and I would not recommend running Citria in this version. Citria is more for like an old school style, very unit heavy Demacia with a bit of like Shen caretaker type stuff, where you play notably fewer spells and just kind of curve out, and are basically more like the old school Bannerman decks, just with a bit of Ionia in. So you actually have like a 1-drop, a 2-drop, a 3-drop, a 4-drop, a 5-drop most times, and then drop your Citria. But this deck often doesn't even have a turn 2 play. It doesn't have a turn 4 or 5 play reliably either, so Citria just isn't that great here. And then we have one Brightsteel formation, just kind of like the Pharon in Noxus decks. It's a one-off power play that can catch you up from behind, that can put the deck in overdrive, and can win you some games that you otherwise wouldn't. And as I mentioned, the deck sometimes struggles with having enough sort of board impact and board presence, and formation is a lot of board impact, a lot of board presence in one card. That is great at mitigating that when you struggle with that. I know some people cut it and feel like it's win more or overkill, and I was open to that consideration, but having played with and without it, I believe that formation is worth it and is a nice addition to the deck. The deck really isn't that fast, so it gets into plenty of situations where you get to drop Brightsteel, and then Brightsteel just takes over the game and wins the game for you, where you otherwise might be struggling or might even be in a losing position. And lastly, let's take a look at the spells. So first off, we have the 3 single combat and 3 concerted strike. That's kind of our interactive package. Concerted strike plays really well with Fiora and River Shaper especially, and even with Screeching Dragon's Fury. It allows you to grow Dragon without it taking damage. It allows you to get Fiora kills without getting damage, which is pretty big given how fragile Fiora can be. And it lets you draw cards with River Shaper. So a common thing will be you use River Shaper first to just draw the card, because it's not good at killing anything, and then like Fiora or Screeching Dragon to finish off whatever you're targeting to get the benefit on those. And then you also potentially draw into more strikes or single combats, for example, with the River Shaper. There is now the new card, the Strafing Strike, but I don't think it's worthwhile. It's the fact that it costs 1 mana more than single combat is pretty irrelevant, and the fact that it heals a dragon too isn't very relevant. Sure, we have 1 dragon, but outside of any of Screeching Dragon, it's much worse than single combat, and it's also pretty different from Concerted Strike, and I also don't want more than 6 of these effects. So 0 Strafing Strike. Then we have 2 Sharpsight. They could also, like, the interesting alternatives to Sharpsight basically are Ranger's Resolve and Notify. But Sharpsight just does a good job. It lets you win trades in combat, which Notify doesn't, and Ranger's Resolve doesn't either. But it is a bit worse against certain spells, but I think overall it's more flexible and a bit more impactful, and also a bit more proactive than Notify and Ranger's Resolve were. I wouldn't mind either of those 2 cards in the deck, but there really isn't room, I think, and the other cards in the deck are better than Notify or Ranger's Resolve in this deck, because they are more flexible, and this is less. This is more sort of in the middle between something like the Lee deck and regular Demacia midrange decks. So you don't quite want to like go full on protect a few key cards with Notify, and you're also not going as wide, so Ranger's Resolve isn't as universally good as it is in sort of a unit heavier Demacia deck, while it is still pretty decent since it's cheap, and even trading 1-for-1 with a Ranger's Resolve is very good. But yeah, I think Sharpsight just kind of hits the sweet spot in a lot of ways, and even the elusive blocking can come up here because the deck is sort of offense, defense, flexible in a weird way, where sometimes being able to use Sharpside to eat an opposing elusive unit can come up and has already come up for me as a nice bonus benefit. Now we have 3 deny. I initially was skeptical whether it should be 2 or 3, but having played it enough, the 3 just are kind of necessary because you're really not that fast and take a while to finish games, so you really need reliable ways to stop powerful spells like Ruinations and Feel the Rush and all that stuff. And otherwise it's still a decent tool to stop a whole bunch of random spells that you don't necessarily always have to stop and wouldn't put deny in your deck for, but still give deny enough flexible use to ultimately make it playable, because if it was only good against a couple of expensive spells, it would be too narrow to play, especially as a 3-off. Then we have the barrier spells. I'm currently on 1 Riposte and 3 Refuge. The original version by BBG had 3 Riposte and 3 Refuge. That was before Sharpside, but I felt like 6 4-cost barrier spells is really clunky, and Sharpside is pretty good. So that's one of the changes I made. And I initially tried to Riposte 2 Refuge, but I felt that the attack buff from Riposte isn't actually that critical, and the deck can really struggle with very aggressive decks, and Refuge is your best tool there with your striking spells and Genevieve Scout to gain back large amounts of health, or sometimes with a big Green Cloud Caretaker, and it's usually kind of the card that just wins you the game against aggressive decks when they are ahead of you, for example. So I would still recommend 3 Refuge, 1 Riposte for now. Could even see maybe trying 3 Sharpside, 0 Riposte, although maybe that's a bit light on barrier spells for Shen and Greenglade Caretaker, which is why I haven't done it yet. But maybe it's worthwhile, because the deck can be clunky, and having a couple more cheap options makes the deck a bit more flexible and flow a bit better. And Constant Strike we already talked about. So yeah, this is the list. Pretty happy with it. Felt pretty good again in the tournaments over the weekend and ladder lately. So yeah, if you enjoy this kind of flexible, proactive, reactive sort of playstyle, give it a try. And as usual, we're gonna hop into some games in Masters to show it in action. So stay tuned for the games in a moment.